Welcome, weary traveler, to the abyss of horror. Step cautiously, for tonight's tale is not just a story, but a chilling whisper carried from the grave. A whisper that coils around your spine and tightens its grip as the shadows deepen. This is the story of the dead mother, a tale of grief, obsession, and the macabre power of love that refuses to die. The village of Dunslow was not a place for the faint of heart. Nestled deep in a valley, it was as if the sun itself avoided its cursed existence. The fog was a constant companion, clinging to the ramshackle cottages and obscuring the faces of the villagers. They were a hardened people, their lives dictated by the harsh realities of nature and the ever-present weight of something unseen. Dunslow held secrets, whispered among the gnarled branches of the ancient trees that bordered its perimeter. Stories of strange lights in the graveyard, of disembodied voices carried on the wind, and of shadows that seemed to move with unnatural purpose. The villagers knew better than to tempt fate. They kept to themselves, their lives a tapestry, woven with superstition and fear. They knew that some doors were best left unopened, some secrets better left buried. But secrets have a way of clawing their way out from the darkness, and in Dunslow, the darkness was always listening. The wind howled through the eaves of the old church, its mournful cry echoing through the empty streets. Rain lashed against the stained glass windows, blurring the images of saints and sinners alike. Inside, a lone figure knelt in prayer. Lydia Fane clutched a worn rosary, her lips moving silently. Her face, etched with worry and grief, was illuminated by the flickering flame of a solitary candle. Her husband, taken too soon in a hunting accident, left a void in her life that threatened to swallow her whole. She had only her son, young James, to cling to. He was a bright spot in her world, his laughter the only music that could penetrate the suffocating silence of her grief. But lately, even his laughter seemed strained, a pale imitation of the joy he once possessed. Lydia knew that something was wrong. She felt it in her bones, a cold dread that seeped into her very soul. She had heard the whispers, the rumors that circulated through the village like a plague wind. They spoke of a darkness that had descended upon Dunslow, a malevolent force that preyed on the vulnerable. Lydia feared for her son. She feared for herself. And as she knelt in the cold, echoing church, she prayed with a fervor that bordered on desperation. She prayed for protection, for guidance, for strength. But her prayers seemed to vanish into the darkness, unanswered and unheard. The wind howled outside, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and decay. And deep within her heart, Lydia felt a growing certainty that something terrible was about to happen. Lydia Fane was a specter long before death claimed her. The villagers often saw her through the fog-choked windows of her dilapidated cottage, her silhouette a stark contrast against the flickering candlelight. She moved with a melancholic grace, her head perpetually bowed beneath the weight of her sorrow. Her love for James was the only shield against the despair that threatened to consume her. She clung to him with a ferocity that bordered on desperation, showering him with a love that was both fierce and fragile. She sang him lullabies each night, her voice cracking with unshed tears, her words imbued with a yearning that transcended the veil of this world. The villagers whispered that Lydia's songs were more than mere lullabies. They spoke of ancient incantations, of forbidden pacts made beneath a blood moon. They claimed that her grief had twisted into something unnatural, something that drew the attention of forces best left undisturbed. They watched her with a mixture of pity and fear, their gazes lingering a moment too long, their whispers following her like shadows. They knew that grief could drive a person to madness, and in Lydia's eyes, they saw a flicker of something wild and untamed. The winter tightened its grip on Dunslow, the frost creeping across the windows like skeletal fingers. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and the fog seemed to seep into the very bones of the village. A palpable sense of dread hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. One morning, silence descended upon the Fane cottage, a silence that was more unsettling than any scream. James's usually cheerful voice, the only sound that had pierced the gloom, was stilled. The villagers noticed his absence from the window, the lack of smoke curling from the chimney. Days turned into nights, the silence stretching, unbroken. Fear, like a virus, spread through the village, twisting their thoughts, poisoning their dreams. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously towards the darkened cottage on the hill. It was old Martha, the village midwife, who finally dared to approach the cottage. She knocked hesitantly, her heart pounding against her ribs. When no answer came, she cautiously pushed the door open, her breath catching in her throat at the sight that greeted her. Lydia lay upon her bed, her skin as pale as the frost that clung to the window panes. Her eyes, once filled with a desperate love, were fixed and staring, reflecting nothing but the cold emptiness of death. James, his small frame trembling, clutched at her hand, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Martha, her heart heavy with pity, gently pried the boy away from his mother's lifeless form. She bundled him in a thick shawl, his small body racked with silent sobs. He didn't seem to understand, his eyes wide and unseeing, his voice a mere whisper of his mother's name. The villagers, their faces grim, prepared Lydia's body for burial. They worked quickly, their movements hurried and nervous. The ground was frozen, solid, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and impending snow. They lowered her coffin into the shallow grave, their gazes averted, their prayers rushed and perfunctory. As the first flakes of snow began to fall, blanketing the graveyard in a pristine white shroud, they left James standing alone beside his mother's grave. He remained there long after the others had departed, his small figure a lone sentinel against the encroaching darkness. The wind howled through the trees, a mournful dirge that echoed the despair in his heart. And deep within the newly turned earth, a promise stirred. A love stronger than death, a bond unbreakable began to claw its way back to the surface. Days turned into weeks. The silence in the Fane cottage, a heavy presence that settled over the village like a shroud. James, now an orphan under the care of the village elder, became a ghost himself. He wandered the cobblestone streets, his eyes vacant, his small hand trailing along the cold stone walls as if seeking his mother's touch. At night, the villagers listened. They listened for the sound of his cries, for the comforting crackle of a hearth fire in the Fane cottage, for any sign of life, from the dwelling that now stood as a constant reminder of their collective guilt and fear. But the silence remained unbroken, save for the whisper of the wind through the skeletal branches of the ancient trees that encircled Dunslow. Then, the whispers began. At first, they were dismissed as the wind playing tricks, a figment of their overactive imaginations. But the whispers persisted, growing stronger each night. They slithered through the narrow alleyways, seeped under doorways, and wormed their way into the dreams of the villagers, planting seeds of unease that blossomed into full-blown terror. James, alone in his grief, was the first to see her. It began subtly, a fleeting glimpse of movement in the periphery, a chill that ran down his spine despite the warmth of the fire. He would wake in the night, heart pounding, a name catching in his throat. Mama? One night as the wind howled outside, rattling the shutters and sending shivers down his spine, he saw her. Standing in the corner of his room, shrouded in shadow, was the unmistakable silhouette of his mother. Mama, he whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, a specter from his nightmares, her presence a suffocating weight in the room. James, a voice cold as the grave and brittle as dried leaves, slithered from the shadows. Don't you recognize your mother? He wanted to run, to scream, to block out the sound of her voice that scraped against his bones like fingernails on a chalkboard. But something held him captive, a love that transcended death, a fear that paralyzed him. Night after night she came to him. Her appearances became more frequent, her form solidifying, the details of her decaying flesh becoming clearer with each passing night. The scent of damp earth and lilies, the flowers that adorned her grave, clung to her like a shroud. She spoke of betrayal, of the villagers' hasty burial, of their abandonment. Her words, once filled with love and warmth, were now laced with a venom that chilled him to the bone. They left me to rot in the cold earth, she hissed, her voice a hollow rasp. They thought they could separate us, but our bond is stronger than death itself. James, his mind teetering between grief and terror, clung to her words as a drowning man clings to a lifeline. He was both repulsed and strangely comforted by her presence. His mother, once a beacon of love and warmth, was now a twisted specter. Her love a suffocating presence that threatened to consume him whole. We'll have our revenge, she whispered, her cold, decaying hand caressing his cheek. They will pay for what they've done. and in the depths of his young, grief-stricken heart, James vowed to help her. He would be her instrument of vengeance, her weapon against the world that had wronged her. He would make them all pay. James became an empty vessel, his spirit hollowed out by grief and filled with his mother's twisted love. He moved through the village like a wraith, his eyes reflecting the emptiness of his soul. The villagers, sensing the change in him, avoided his gaze, their whispers turning from pity to fear. Lydia's instructions came in whispers, cold and insidious, worming their way into his mind, poisoning his thoughts. She spoke of the villagers' transgressions, their fear, their guilt. She planted seeds of anger and resentment, nurturing them with promises of vengeance and a love that knew no bounds. He began with small acts of defiance, subtle gestures that hinted at the darkness brewing within him. He left dead animals on doorsteps, their lifeless eyes staring accusingly. He carved strange symbols into the wooden beams of houses, symbols that spoke of death and decay. The villagers, their superstitions running deep, saw these acts for what they were: warnings, portents of a coming storm. The whispers intensified, spreading through the village like a plague. They carried Lydia's rage, her bitterness, her insatiable need for revenge. The villagers, their nerves frayed, started to turn on each other, their suspicions fueled by fear and the constant whispers that echoed through their once peaceful lives. Old grudges resurfaced, fueled by paranoia and the whispers that planted seeds of doubt in their hearts. Neighbors who had once shared bread and wine now eyed each other with suspicion, their conversations laced with unspoken accusations. Lydia reveled in their fear, her spectral form growing stronger with each act of cruelty, each whispered threat. She was the puppet master, and the villagers were her unwitting puppets, dancing to the tune of her vengeance. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, a palpable sense of dread descended upon Dunslow. The fog, once a constant companion, now seemed to pulsate with an unnatural energy, swirling and shifting as if alive. The whispers reached a fever pitch, echoing through the empty streets, slithering through the cracks in the walls, invading the dreams of the terrified villagers. They spoke of a reckoning, of a debt that must be paid. Lydia was preparing for her final act of vengeance, and the village of Dunslow would be the stage for her macabre masterpiece. The storm was gathering, and soon the full force of her wrath would be unleashed upon the unsuspecting villagers. The first sign was the livestock. One by one, they began to die. Cows, sheep, even the chickens, all found mangled in their pens, their eyes wide with terror, their bodies twisted at unnatural angles. The villagers whispered about a wild animal, a wolf perhaps, driven mad by the encroaching winter. But deep down, a primal fear took root. This was no animal. This was something else. Then came the accidents. Old Man Hemlock, His mind, addled by age, stumbled into the well one fog-choked morning. Young Thomas, the baker's son, fell from a tree, his neck snapping like a dry twig. Mary, the barmaid known for her quick wit and even quicker smile, was found dead in her bed, her face frozen in a silent scream. Fear, like a virus, spread through the village, seeping into every crack and crevice. The villagers, once a tight-knit community, now eyed each other with suspicion. Whispers of curses and witchcraft followed them like shadows. They had tried to bury their guilt, to forget the fear in Lydia's eyes when they lowered her coffin into the cold, unforgiving earth. But the earth, it seemed, had other plans. The fog grew thicker, heavier, as if the very air itself was suffocating under the weight of dread. It seeped into homes, clung to clothes, tasted metallic on their tongues. It was more than just fog. It was a presence, a suffocating blanket of fear that enveloped the village. They huddled in their homes, shutters barred, doors bolted, praying for the sun to break through the oppressive gloom. But the sun had abandoned Dunslow, leaving them at the mercy of the shadows that danced at the edge of their vision. The whispers intensified, no longer confined to the night. They heard them in the rustling leaves, the creaking floorboards, the howling wind. Lydia's voice, cold and vengeful, echoed through their dreams, promising retribution, promising pain. The villagers had become prisoners in their own homes, trapped in a nightmare of their own making. They had buried Lydia in the cold earth, but they had failed to bury their fear. And fear, like a seed planted in fertile ground, had taken root and grown into a monstrous thing. Section 3. The Night of the Screaming Dead. The storm broke on the eve of All Hallows' Eve, a night when the veil between the worlds was said to be at its thinnest. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the village in a grotesque tableau. Thunder shook the very foundations of their homes, each boom a death knell. And then the screams began. Not the screams of the living, but the chilling moans of the dead, rising from their graves in a grotesque parody of life. They clawed their way out of the cold earth, their skeletal hands reaching for the living, their empty sockets burning with an unholy light. The villagers, their sanity stretched to the breaking point, watched in horror as the dead converged on the village square, their numbers swelling with each passing moment. They were led by a figure as familiar as it was terrifying, Lydia. But this was not the frail, grieving mother they remembered. This was something else entirely. Her eyes, once filled with love for her son, now blazed with a cold, vengeful fire. Her skin, once soft and pale, was stretched taut over her bones, her touch promising not comfort, but the icy embrace of death. The night of the screaming dead had begun. Panic seized the village. Men, women, and children, their faces twisted in terror, stumbled through the mud and the driving rain, desperate to escape the relentless advance of the dead. But there was nowhere to hide. The dead were everywhere, their skeletal hands reaching, their voices a chorus of moans and shrieks that echoed through the night. The air grew thick with the stench of decay. the sweet, cloying smell of death mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Screams were cut short, replaced by the sickening crunch of bone and the gurgling gasps of the dying. The cobblestones, slick with rain and blood, became a treacherous labyrinth, each step a gamble with death. Lydia, her spectral form towering over the chaos, reveled in the carnage. Her laughter, cold and brittle as the icy rain, echoed through the streets, a chilling counterpoint to the symphony of screams that rose from the dying village. She had warned them. They had buried her alive, left her to rot in the cold earth. Now they would pay. They would all pay. Section 2. An Unholy Communion. James, his eyes wide and vacant, stood at his mother's side, his small hand clasped in her cold, decaying grip. He watched the carnage unfold with a detached curiosity, his mind numb to the horror that swirled around him. He was a stranger in his own body, a puppet dancing to the tune of his mother's vengeance. Lydia, her eyes burning with an unholy light, pulls James close, her decaying hand resting on his shoulder. He stares straight ahead, his face devoid of emotion, a single tear tracing a path through the dirt on his cheek. "See, James?" Lydia's voice, amplified by an unearthly power, boomed through the night. "This is what they did to us. This is what they deserve. The villagers, those who were left, fought back with a desperate ferocity, but they were no match for the relentless onslaught of the dead. Their weapons, their prayers, their pleas for mercy, all were met with the same cold, unfeeling stare, the same insatiable hunger. As the night wore on, the screams faded, replaced by the moans of the dead and the soft, rhythmic thud of their decaying feet on the cobblestone streets. The rain continued to fall, washing away the blood. But the stench of death lingered, a grim reminder of the night Dunslow became a graveyard. The storm subsided as quickly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie silence that was more unsettling than the roar of the wind and rain. A thin mist clung to the village, obscuring the carnage, but the stench of death was inescapable. Lydia, her spectral form flickering in the pale light of dawn, surveyed the scene with a cold satisfaction. The village of Dunslow was no more. Only ruins and the lingering presence of death remained. She turned to James, her skeletal hand reaching out to caress his cheek. He didn't flinch, his vacant eyes staring straight ahead. He was hers now, body and soul. "Come, my love," she whispered, her voice a hollow echo of its former warmth. "We have work to do." She led him through the remnants of the village, past the broken bodies and the vacant stares of the dead, towards the outskirts of Dunslow, where the ancient forest stood, dark and silent, waiting to reclaim what was rightfully hers. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The outside world, if it even remembered the village of Dunslow, spoke of a plague, a fire, some natural disaster that had wiped it clean from the face of the earth. No one dared venture too close. The stories persisted, whispers of strange lights in the forest, of disembodied screams echoing through the trees, of a woman in a white dress who wandered the mist-shrouded paths, her eyes glowing with an unholy light. And what of James? Some whispered that he had perished along with the rest of the villagers, another victim of his mother's twisted love. Others claimed that he still lived, a hollow shell of a boy, forever bound to his mother's side, wandering the spectral ruins of Dunslow, carrying out her vengeful bidding for all eternity. The truth, like the village itself, was lost to the mists of time. Another chilling tale whispered around campfires, a warning to those who dared to tempt the darkness. For in the abyss of grief and despair, love can twist into something monstrous, something that even death cannot destroy. The village of Dunslow remains lost, swallowed by the earth and the tendrils of the hungry forest. The fog, thicker than ever, guards its secrets, a silent sentinel against the curious and the foolish. Those who dare venture too close speak of an oppressive silence, a coldness that seeps into their bones. They claim to see flickering lights through the trees, hear the faint strains of a lullaby carried on the wind, a lullaby that chills them to the core. The dead mother and her son, bound together by a love twisted beyond recognition, are the stuff of legend now, a cautionary tale whispered around flickering candlelight. They serve as a reminder that some wounds run deeper than the grave, that some bonds can never be broken even in death. And so, dear traveler, heed the warnings. Turn back while you still can. For the shadows of Dunslow hold no comfort, only the chilling embrace of a love that consumes all in its path. The abyss of horror has claimed its due, and the echoes of its victims linger, a testament to the darkness that lies at the heart of even the most sacred of bonds. Remember Dunslow. Remember the dead mother. And remember that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are born not of nightmares, but of love gone terribly, irrevocably wrong.